react. You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 oh. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home. Begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. You're crying age, in defeat is now your only friend.
Hey Nick, Sean Spicer. I understand there's some controversy brewing about how many subscribers you have on YouTube. You have more subscribers than anybody. Then it's probably the biggest, largest YouTube subscription that anybody's had. But also, it's not numbers that matter, Nick. And I know everyone's going to quibble over this, but it's content. It's quality, and your subscribers are amazing. They're great. They're high quality subscribers, and that's really what you have to look at. Don't just focus on the numbers. I mean, if people are spewing a bunch of fake news, just don't get in the mud. They're amazing folks. Their engagement, the way that they like the videos. Anyway, I hope this puts this to the end. I hope that this controversy is over, and we know who the real YouTube subscriber champ is, and it's you, Nick.
Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone, to In Time. Thank you all for joining us. The Sean Spicer, we played the Sean Spicer intro there twice in a row. I got to tell you, I think it's funny. And obviously, we're kind of making fun of him just a little bit, but I don't like giving him that much airtime, so I'll have to make sure that one doesn't air again for a little while. Thank you all for joining us. With me today is 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐻𝐸. 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐻𝐸, how you doing?
Okay.
𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐻𝐸? 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐻𝐸, you there?
Can you hear me?
I'm
here.
Folks, I guess we lost 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐻𝐸. Sorry about that. I'm not going to go too far with that before people start to think it's real.
Yeah, I could hear him.
Yeah, I know. Inside joke. Bad inside joke. Yeah, one show where we have I'd like to have a show where we don't have audio problems. I could hear him. It's a miracle given our production values, but I heard him. Well, thank you all for joining us. There's been so many memes where it's like 2001. You know, you see 2001 destroying something, and then the people say, "Well, it can't get any worse than 2001." 2002 comes along and says, "Hold my beer." You know, and so we've all seen this monkeypox thing. Dear Lord, excuse me. We've all seen about monkeypox. There's been an outbreak in an extraordinarily unusual way. And the CDC came out and said it's really nothing to worry about. It's extremely difficult to get. And, you know, these kinds of things do happen from time to time, and it's not an indication that the world's about to end. Other people have come out and said, well, maybe there is cause for concern. And then one of the biggies was a purported internal leak from the CDC suggested that they're actually terrified and, excuse me, they're terrified. They're worried that this is really going to spread out of control. And at this point, given that we've had some cause to be upset with the CDC and how they presented certain things recently and how they've been influenced politically, it's sort of like we don't know what on earth is going on and what it all means. So we have brought with us today our resident expert on all things that we don't, not all things we don't understand, on science things that we don't understand, and probably on a good number of things that I don't understand, truth be told. We have brought with us today 𝗲𝗲. 𝗲𝗲, how are you doing?
Not too bad. Just hanging in there, busy as usual. Ready to, I guess, rinse and repeat for another infectious disease, as it were. So,
well, there's always something. And I guess today, one of the things that's been a little tough with this is it's already been a little, I don't want to say politicized. That's probably a misnomer, but there's. Because it turns out that it looks like maybe this last infection was a sort of STD. Well, last time people talked about STDs, and there's people that got weaponized, and so you see all sorts of things going on. So why don't we start out with the easy question, ostensibly: what the hell is monkeypox, and why are people getting something that monkeypox really? Who brought the monkey to the party, and what happened?
So let's just start off from the top. All right. Monkeypox is a bit of a misnomer. It's a sign that, again, scientists are actually pretty atrocious at naming things. It was really described in monkeys first, and that's kind of why it's called monkeypox. But this is actually something that's spread primarily by rodents, at least in the animal kingdom. So with that being said, what we're dealing with is a virus. It's in the family called 𝗲𝗲 viruses. That's something people don't really need to remember, but people will kind of, I think, freak out and get worried to some extent because one of the other prominent viruses in this group of viruses is smallpox, which has been eradicated since 1980, save a couple of vials stored in laboratories in Atlanta in the US CDC and in Russian labs. This is obviously something that was of Cold War fame, and interestingly enough, we'll probably mention this later, but a lot of the Cold War era fears about smallpox might actually come in handy here as the initial monkeypox situation actually kind of starts to develop here in the US. But essentially, we're dealing with a virus that is pretty closely related to smallpox. There are two strains of it, one being less lethal than the other, and that one seems to be the one we are currently dealing with right now, which is an early bit of good news. Generally speaking, this is a virus that is kind of referred to as a generalist. It really doesn't care how it spreads. Primarily, it's spread through direct contact. So one good way to do that is sex or skin-to-skin contact, really. Another way that you can have that happen is by using clothes from an infected person, sleeping in the same bed, sharing utensils. Anything really like that also applies. It can also be spread by contaminated surfaces, simply by brushing up against somebody who has it, especially if they have lesions on their skin. It can also technically be spread through the air, but at least from our prior knowledge about monkeypox historically, that's typically not the primary route of transmission. Generally, what you see first to sort of kick things off is an animal to human transmission. So this is something that's called a zoonotic illness. So animals have reservoirs of monkeypox in them, and when sick animals make contact with people, they can transmit the virus to people. That's very likely to be what happened with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, and there's really no indicator that monkeypox is functioning any differently in terms of it initially starting from an animal and then that animal transmitting to a human. So generally speaking, that's kind of what we're dealing with. It does not replicate nearly as fast as COVID. The incubation period is very long. We're talking anywhere from 5 to 21 days. I think a lot of the averages pin it around 1 to 2 weeks. But there's a lot of variability there. And that's certainly playing a role in sort of the initial burst of cases that we're seeing around the world in terms of, how quickly they seem to be popping up, and, if that's any indicator of how actually, transmissible and quick in terms of virus replication monkeypox actually is. So generally speaking, that's kind of where the very brief overview of the situation lies right now. I think we're looking at about 100 cases, maybe a little less, across 12 different countries, a lot of them being Western countries. At least those are the countries that are full of the infrastructure and testing sophisticated enough to confirm a lot of these cases are, in fact, monkeypox.
There was a big deal made about the fact that the U.S. has now actually tried to acquire some extra smallpox vaccines, and that maybe this is an indication that the U.S. is anticipating something terrible is about to pop off. Excuse me. You had said that it's in the same class. Would the smallpox vaccine be effective at all in any way against this? And would it be prudent, regardless of how serious this may or may not be as a problem, would it be prudent for the U.S. to make sure it's got a good stockpile of it?
Yeah, so I mean, we're already kind of in a good spot as far as that's concerned. If we're talking about sort of the OG smallpox vaccine, of the Cold War era, at least on paper, from the data that we have so far, that vaccine does provide good cross-protective immunity to the monkeypox virus. So I think current estimates clock it in at 85% effective at preventing monkeypox virus infection in the first place. It's also important to note that there are essentially two types of smallpox vaccine that exist. The one that we're kind of thinking of, the one that previous generations actually got in the time where people were trying to eradicate smallpox. That one is a live smallpox virus vaccine, which is not going to be safe for people who are otherwise vulnerable or immunocompromised. And that vaccine does come with a long list of potential complications because it's the live real deal. So it certainly comes with some potential for some adverse events simply because it's just a diluted down amount of the live smallpox virus. But again, that vaccine has a 85% effectiveness in terms of preventing monkeypox infection. Now, good news, technology has caught up, and there is a second vaccine, which is it's a smallpox vaccine, but instead of it being live, it is essentially an attenuated vaccine, so it cannot replicate. And that is safe for people who are immunocompromised and people who have, autoimmune conditions, and certainly including but not limited to things like eczema, atopic dermatitis, and things like that. So that vaccine, that second vaccine, is being not only mobilized from the U.S. national stockpile, but the U.S. government, before this even started, actually purchased more of this from the company that makes it, Bavarian Nordic, for the national stockpile. So a lot of what's in the stockpile right now is the older live replicating vaccine that might not be safe for everybody, but we do have some of the newer safe for everybody vaccine, which does also have a pretty good cross-protective immunity for monkeypox as well. And the latter seems to have a little bit more favorable data in terms of protection against monkeypox. So I think that's why the U.S. government was wanting to up its stockpile of that one in particular. I know in the UK, I don't know what their vaccine stockpile in that actually looks like, but in response to some of the initial cases, they actually have begun the strategy called ring vaccination. Essentially what this means is if you have one person who has a confirmed case of monkeypox, you find all their close contacts. Let's say hypothetically, in a hypothetical scenario, they have 5 close contacts. The government will take those 5 people and vaccinate them sort of as a post-exposure prophylaxis type situation to try and prevent them from actually developing monkeypox over the incubation period. And that's something that has been very successful in years past with a variety of different infectious diseases. So that's already beginning. And I think because we're not starting from scratch here, like we did from COVID, we will be a lot more able to respond in the immediate short term if we see more cases of monkeypox. We aren't starting from a position where there's nothing we can do and we're just kind of like helpless watching, trying not to get the damn thing. We have vaccines and we actually have antivirals too. So that's kind of where it stands in terms of the vaccines and kind of what people are doing right now to mobilize them.
I've heard that the death rate on this is astonishingly high, 10%. Is that accurate?
So it's kind of relative to which strain you're talking about. The one that we're dealing with is a lot less lethal. The number you'll see cited a lot, especially from the more, I guess, fear-mongery types online. They'll cite 10%, which is 10 times the lethality rate generally of COVID-19. But again, the less lethal strain, the West African strain, is the one that we're dealing with, and that one, I think its fatality rate is closer to like 1%. So I definitely think people can at least relax a little bit. We're dealing with the less lethal version from the early genetic sequences that we've gotten back from the first batch of monkeypox patients in Portugal, I think. That's the version we're dealing with. So at the very least, we're not dealing with the known entity with a 10% fatality rate. So far, out of all the cases that have been detected, nobody's died, and I don't even think most of them haven't needed to go to the hospital. I don't know if all of them didn't even need to go to the hospital, but I know most of them have been able to avoid hospitalization entirely. So I think that's another good omen.
Really? We're trying to grow as a channel. We're trying to get more subs, and instead of saying we're all going to die and running around with your hair on, we need to work on your presentation, sir, because I thought we discussed this before you came on, but this, we're going to be fine kind of shit really doesn't cut it. Okay. Is there anything with the also? My understanding is that death rate also pertains to sort of the level of care. So, countries with inadequate medical facilities, that number is going to be a lot higher. And while that's always possibly the case with COVID, it's like once you get to the point where you're in the ICU, there's not a heck of a lot they could do for you anyway. With this, does this level of medical care have an impact on that number significantly?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say absolutely. The availability of medical care is going to certainly impact the disease course and clinical outcome for sure. And I definitely think people also can kind of keep that in mind, especially if they're even if we were dealing with the more lethal strain, which we aren't. That lethality percentage certainly takes into account the fact that a lot of these prior cases of monkeypox have been described as sort of larger outbreaks in more developing countries. Some of the outbreaks in Western countries have simply been due to importing infected rodents from places in Africa like Nigeria into Indiana in the United States. That's one of the most recent outbreaks in 2003 happened that way. So out of all of the people in the United States that got sick in 2003, I don't think any of them actually wound up dying. So with that being said, it certainly would stand to reason that in more Western countries, I would expect fewer issues with people needing hospitalization. So,
okay, so Titan here has reminded me, I think he's right, we have to save all the doom and gloom. Sorry for our new show. It's going to be airing next week called Out of Time. So that's where we're going to talk about well, listen, if Trump gets elected, we'll do it. If Trump I swear to God, if Trump does, we are going to start a new show. It's going to be called Out of Time. All right. So so far that sounds reasonably good, and I do think, and we know this, and we've had this discussion before, not you and us per se, but certainly on this program, that if it bleeds, it leads, and the more dramatic it is, the more you can. And we've switched to this 24-hour news cycle. They're constantly looking for news, so people are trying to fabricate this, and so it sounds like there's reason for optimism now. 75 to 100 cases all of a sudden when it used to be zero. Is that a cause for concern? Is it possible that that's just nothing? And is it possible that that's something huge? How do we know? When are we going to know? And how worried should we be?
Yeah, so I think certainly it's alarming in a very, I guess, a proverbial sense. And I think that's kind of something that we've been like hypersensitized to, especially because we've lived through COVID now. We're in year 3 of COVID, so we're all kind of like in that mentality of like hyper focusing on infectious disease and the spread of it. And in this circumstance, it's not like a bad thing per se, but I think it certainly riles people up more so than they really needed to be riled up at this point in time. Certainly if the situation like drastically changes, then people can react accordingly, and there may or may not be data to follow along if the situation drastically changes. But this is something that like it's a known entity. We have tests for it. It's something that we're actively looking for. So I think people shouldn't be surprised if we keep finding it because, again, we know what it is. We have contact tracing going on. The longer incubation period sort of affords us more time to actually sort of go look for it in some of these close contacts. It's not like COVID where, at the point it is now where it's 3 days and boom, you're sick and you might have spread it to a whole bunch of people within 3 days. Monkeypox is a slower going thing. So again, that time allows us the ability to do more work in terms of the contact tracing to find possible cases and confirm them or rule them out as monkeypox. So I think that's, again, kind of a good omen, the fact that public health officials are actively looking for this because it's a known entity. We have tests for it, and that's all they've been able to find is this first batch of 90 cases. We haven't even broken triple digits yet. Now, of course, any case is not a good thing. I'm not here to be pro monkeypox in any sense.
Yeah.
We are anti-disease, I think, generally speaking, in science and medicine. We want to prevent it if we can.
Well, thank you for coming on and making such a bold claim. This is an In Time channel of the bold claims. We here at In Time denounce monkeypox and are against the. Thank you for that. I appreciate your clarifying your position on monkeypox and other diseases. Please continue.
Yeah, I mean, it seems a little like facetious to say that, but I think a lot of people, again, have been really hypersensitized with respect to COVID and sort of the more institutional failures around science communication. And as monkeypox has developed, people are freaking out and thinking that the sky's falling, and now we've got 2 pandemics to deal with, and we're all going to get sick and die with both of them at the same time or something. But in reality, like, despite the institutional failures, things actually seem to be operating more like a well-oiled machine simply because monkeypox is a known entity and there already were a lot of measures in place to deal with something like this. Just as an example, some of the earlier cases, and I know the one in the US that was first confirmed, it was a 3-day turnaround time between when a physician identified it in an exam room to when the CDC actually confirmed it. So things actually moved relatively quickly. From somebody going to their doctor saying, hey, what's going on here, to the CDC actually being aware and on the case with like positive test results in hand. So, I think it actually kind of speaks to how some of these things were like not in place for COVID. And, we should have ideally, some sort of strategy and or infrastructure to deal with, novel diseases that pop up in the future. Because right now, at the very least, things seem to be working as intended for, detecting monkeypox cases and getting ahead of it, which I know is something really inconceivable for people considering what COVID has put us all through. The notion of getting ahead of an infectious disease seems foreign, but at the very least, it seems like officials are on it more so than they were for COVID, and that's another good omen.
Well, it seems like at least it's harder to transmit than COVID too, which is thank God for that. I do want to, as an aside, slightly off topic for a second. One of my pet peeves that we have, and I never actually really discussed on this show, but it's something I mention online a lot. I mention on Twitter a lot, and is a huge pet peeve, is this idea that scientists are sitting on the cure for cancer, and the reason they don't, they don't release it is because they make so much money. And at first, that seems. Yeah. Well, and at first that seems to make some sense until you look at it with any sense of perspective in human history and realize that every time we cure a disease, people live longer. When people live longer, what do they need more of? Health care. They need more science. They need more anti-aging cream. They need more of all of that stuff. The reason the pharmaceutical complex has gotten so biopharmaceutical complex has gotten so large is because we're living so much longer due to its successes in the past. And if they want to make money, they cure cancer. And then when people live longer, we're going to want more drugs. So if it's something that you feel competent and or are interested in discussing, we should have you on just to discuss that entire concept, because it's phenomenally dangerous, damaging, and kind of idiotic if you stop to think about it for even 10 seconds. But so if you're interested, I'll reach out to you, or you talk to me. But if you're interested in discussing that one, because that's one of my pet peeves, and we've never talked about it. This, news, this idea that scientists are sitting on. Give me a break. And if you know a scientist, they're usually very hardworking, and if they really want to be rich, that have gone onto Wall Street. At any rate,
sounds like a plan.
Yeah, all right, let's do that. So I've heard also said a couple of times, now this is still, and this is what it is, it's like, so first of all, if you know anything about that so-called CDC leak, if you can tell us a little bit about that and what that means. But also the other thing I want to ask about is, and again, since this is just starting to hit the public consciousness and we kind of wanted to get ahead of that, I've heard once or twice people already say that they're talking about it as a gay disease. So if you can explain sort of why that narrative is hitting around and where that's coming from, would love to get sort of an explanation on that. So those are my two immediate questions.
So actually, you might be able to give me some more context on the CDC leak thing, because you're actually this is the first I'm hearing about it, which is actually kind of surprising. Because I actively look peer into the conspiracy theory abyss often, just to kind of see what's being said and what's going on. All that I've heard so far, at least in that sphere, is that the Wuhan Institute of Virology actually made monkeypox too, which
for fuck's sake,
is a very easy, quick debunk, since they were actually just trying to develop a more novel test with a third of the virus's genetic code, meaning you can't make a full virus if you're only using a third of it. So that's just a silly one and done type thing. If you have any links or anything in terms of a CDC leak, I'd be more than happy to take a look at them and sort of give you even a live reaction to it. I can address the second one actually pretty readily, because certainly a lot of the public discourse and consciousness so far has kind of hyper-focused on that notion that monkeypox is a gay disease for some reason. I think it's a combination of things. The more historical contributing factor to that perception is going to be HIV, simply because I think part of it's the name of monkeypox, the fact that HIV might have adapted in non-human primates and then jumped into people as its sort of first foray into the human body. So I think people were kind of putting two and two together and taking that and then slapping it together with the UK Health Security Agency, or the UKHSA, sort of their public health authority, releasing a statement very early on that all of their cases were in primarily men who have sex with men, or MSM populations. And generally speaking, a lot of the cases identified in the countries where monkeypox is present are in men, and a lot of them are in MSM populations. But with that being said, there's no magical gay antigen or gay protein that the virus prefers and latches onto that solely exists in gay men or MSM. That's not a thing. It's never been a thing.
Are you sure about that?
Hey, look, if that's a thing, if I make a discovery, I've got a whole prize waiting for me in Switzerland with a whole lot of money attached to it. So, if that exists, put me on the case. I'll find it. I'll characterize it.
Which, by the way, is I mean that's the other one too. When when you're talking to an to a religious person who says that the community is against God, it's sort of if there was a scientist who found a proof for God, they would win the Nobel Prize in perpetuity for the rest of existence. Science is just as interested in science is interested in the facts. So, okay, so we can shoot that theory down. All right. And so what I'm looking at, we have two. I'm looking at one is the World Health Organization holding an emergency meeting to discuss the recent outbreak, but it wasn't. But this was part of what's been feeding. Okay, there's been 100 cases. There's a World Health Organization emergency meeting. How serious is this? But I know we've got in our records. If you go to our Discord, we do have it. I'm having a hard time finding it in the middle of the show. So if I'd been smart, I'd have had that queued up beforehand. So the only one I was able to get was
search your Discord. Let me take a look.
And unfortunately, we did lose a Xandering. I don't think it was my fault. It was possible at this point. I shouldn't rule anything off the table. But yeah, there was okay. Well, you know what? I can do that in a second. All right. So while you're doing that, so it sounds like, and I want to make sure that I have this characterized properly. It sounds like it's not that easy to try. Oh, we did have a question actually. Before I get to that, let me ask the question because otherwise I'll forget. Which is, does monkeypox leave scarring similar to, say, for example, smallpox? After you've had monkeypox, is scarring an issue?
So I think that the scarring that people remember is actually scarring from the smallpox vaccine rather than the disease itself. That was actually kind of like the old school vaccine passport. If you got your smallpox vaccine, you had a physical scar to prove it. So I think with that being said, I don't think the newer smallpox vaccine that's being mobilized and produced in greater quantity, the brand name I think is Jynneos, I don't think that leaves a scar. The scarification process I don't think is actually a thing for that. I could be wrong on that, so you can take me with a little bit of salt here, but to my knowledge, at least all of the infectious disease professionals who have been talking about this that I've seen and talked to, they haven't mentioned anything like that about either the vaccine, the newer vaccine, or the monkeypox disease itself, sort of leaving a identifiable scar, as it were.
And my recollection is most of the scarring actually comes from the itching and then a lot of scratching and then doing significant damage that can because people scratch at it compulsively, and then that can lead to some scarring. It's the only scarring I sort of vaguely remember hearing about, and the chances that I'm wrong are far greater than the chances you are on it. So we'll take that with several grains of salt. We also have a super chat. Let's see, we have a $5 super chat, Sinister Porpoise. Sinister, thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate it. The Aquatic Mammal and Solipsist Society is pro-virus because we use Linux. Reminds me of those Mac commercials. What is it? Do you remember? Did you see those? The Mac commercials. Now I've forgotten who it was who did them. One of them was the kid who was in Live Free and Die Hard. He played Apple, and then that other John something played Mac, and he'd constantly, "Oh, don't get near me! I have a virus." He goes, "Well, you're a PC. You get viruses. I'm a Mac. We don't have viruses." And,
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. Those were. I met him. I went to a show of his that was hilarious. He ended up naked by the end of the show, which was unexpected. He made a joke about taking off all his clothes at the beginning of the show, and then towards the end of the show, he starts taking off his clothes, and then he's like, "Well, I call this Chekhov's underwear. If you're going to say you're going to be naked by the end of the show, you better be naked by the end of the show." Yeah, so I obviously it made an impression. Anyways, it was all right. So let's see. There was one other question. So let me just see if I can frame this properly. So we've got a prop. Does it happen? Actually, I guess I'll ask you this question to lead into it. Does it happen that sometimes you'll get an outbreak like this and it just vanishes, or it becomes something big? And is that how often does that happen? Is this really something that's extraordinary, or it's like, hey, it happens with a lot of different viruses, and there's nothing to worry about yet. We'll keep an eye on it, but.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a kind of a question on a lot of people's minds, right? Is this something that's going to blow up to COVID style, and are we going to sort of be trapped in a double virus hell, as opposed to the current single virus hell that we've been living through for 3 years? I think this is definitely the wait and see mode. A lot of the early genetic sequencing results have shown some signs that compared to prior versions of this same strain of monkeypox, compared to sort of the reference from 2018, which is not all that long ago, the newer current monkeypox virus genetic sequences isolated from the current patients, it does show some degree of mutation, but it's also important to kind of keep in mind, like monkeypox, the virus itself, it's a very large virus. It has a lot more genetic code than SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. It's a DNA virus, so the biology is very different here. All of this to say, if out of the 50 or so mutations that they've seen, it really is uncertain at this point whether any of them have any functional impact. And I think that's kind of what's going to seep into the news cycle is, oh my gosh, the monkeypox virus, it's mutated and now it's infecting people. Look at all these cases. We're all going to die. But we kind of have to wait and see. Like, we have to wait for the scientists to do the actual lab experiments. Like, hey, is this something that's actually relevant to the virus's biology? Do these mutations make it more transmissible, or increase the viral load, or anything, actually relevant? So I think people sort of turning the, genetic sequencing into a spectator sport type thing, where they're kind of, holding their breath for the latest mutations and trying to figure out if they mean anything. It's not going to necessarily be the best thing, simply because there's a lot of lab experiments to do. That's going to take a long time to actually figure this out. Some of the early indications from virologists actually seem to think these mutations are not necessarily like a function of the virus gaining some sort of ability or feature it didn't have before, but rather the host's immune system defenses actually acting on the virus's genetic code, but ultimately failing to kill off the virus. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic that I think might get sort of lost in the news cycle and lost in the sauce, is that what's really being seen isn't so much the virus going Super Saiyan or something, but rather like wherever it came from, maybe in the animal reservoir that it was just kind of hanging around in, it managed to sort of evade immune system defenses, and as a consequence, it kind of has these genetic marks or scars or whatever you want to call them in its genetic code that to us look like mutations, because they are technically, but that's simply only in comparison to the reference version from 2018. So it's really kind of uncertain at this point if it's actually truly like mutating in a way that suggests like natural selection is acting on it and it's become more evolutionarily fit, or if this is simply an artifact of prior battles with the immune systems from either the animal reservoirs it came from, or possibly some of the cases of monkeypox that kind of set this whole chain of transmission into motion, where it might have gone spreading in the community undetected. So there's still a lot of uncertainties, I think, in that respect, in terms of like whether this is going to take off. It's also very possible, like you said, that this does burn itself out. And I think the fact that we have vaccines and antivirals already from the start lends itself to that being the more likely outcome. If we can engage in ring vaccination, vaccinate the close contacts, and sort of get them to isolate and quarantine, we stand a pretty good chance of getting ahead of the spread. I think this is kind of another thing that people like hyper-focus and freak out about in terms of the mutations. There's one paper from like yesteryear. It was a laboratory study. It's like solely laboratory conditions, where it did show monkeypox could spread pretty readily by aerosols. And that's been a hot button topic as it pertains to COVID. But right now, people are now kind of transposing a laboratory experiment onto what's happening in the real world, which aren't necessarily a one-to-one equivalency, basically saying, oh my gosh, we've got 90 cases, it's spreading in the air, we're all going to die. When in reality, okay, if you're concerned about that, you should be wearing a mask for COVID anyways. So that's not going to be a problem for monkeypox. Like, you're already doing all the right stuff, ideally. So like, chill. Like, it's not something you need to like immediately worry about. COVID is the more immediately concerning issue for the average American right now, and I would highly emphasize that as this monkeypox thing goes on. Again, we're not starting from scratch. We're on it. We can contact trace more effectively. We have tests. We have vaccines. We have antivirals. We have a much better idea of what's going on here. Things are working better compared to kind of the train wreck that COVID has been. So all of that together, I think, suggests things will. It's more likely that it'll burn itself out. But even in the event that it doesn't, like, we can still blunt the spread if it somehow takes off because of everything I just mentioned.
And just so people are aware, so how often do we see mutations in something like this that end up being inconsequential?
I mean, it's pretty often. I mean, you can take a look at SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. This has actually kind of been one of my pet peeves over the pandemic, is that both in terms of like the research groups within science, to me, I feel like there's been a shortage of people who are like dedicated solely to figuring out the answer to that exact question for all the mutations that have popped up in that virus. There's a whole bunch, and sometimes an individual mutation can make the difference for SARS-CoV-2 in terms of the biology, in terms of our vaccine immunity, in terms of viral load, and what have you. But again, the situation is a lot more complicated with monkeypox simply because its genetic code is DNA instead of RNA. It's got a lot more genetic code overall. It's got over 200 genes. It has a lot of different strategies that it uses in its spread that have just kind of been, always a feature of monkeypox in terms of genetic reassortment and making copies of genes and stuff like that. And the impact of any one singular mutation on all of that is going to be really hard to ascertain without a lot of like laboratory experiments dedicated to figuring it out. But just in general, whether it's a virus, a bacterium, our own bodies, mutations a lot of the time can be inconsequential. It could stand to reason that, one single mutation doesn't change anything in terms of a particular protein or its function, and it's just simply an artifact kind of just chilling in the genetic code, really not impacting anything. Sometimes it could, break a gene and cause cancer in somebody's own body, independent of infectious disease as a concept. So just in terms of like genetics as a whole, mutations, really, it's just context. Like it really depends on like where they are in the genetic code and whether they actually change anything in terms of protein structure, composition, or function. And, based on that, there's a whole laundry list of possibilities and outcomes. So again, I think it's kind of really difficult to have anybody, scientist or not, hyper focus on these 50 new mutations outside of the actual like virologists and geneticists that are like working on this, outside of the professionals whose job it is to do this. I just don't think it's like a good idea for people to speculate, because there's still a lot of work to be done to give us at least a clue as to what's going on, if anything.
All right, so it sounds like, and so we can wrap this up. I don't think this is going to be a hugely long show, because it sounds, I think we've got a handle on it. But if I understand correctly, it sounds like I'm hearing is that, for the most part, the mortality figures appear to be pretty low. It appears to be manageable. We actually happen to be ahead of it already. The transmissibility isn't as high as COVID, and any of the normal precautions you would take for COVID would also work in this situation, with the possible exception of the sharing clothes or bed or stuff like that. But that and we appear to be ahead of it. And even if none of those things were true, we still don't know yet how or if this thing would possibly expand past, in any meaningful way, expand past what we've seen. Is that roughly accurate for what you've been saying?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary. I think I'll also kind of add on to that even in the event that like the situation radically changes and it does like take off wildly, I think a lot of the infectious disease professionals, to varying degrees, have been humbled by COVID. I think that's one of the lessons that the ones who are acting in good faith actually have taken into account the fact that sometimes sort of our old textbook knowledge isn't necessarily a one-to-one equivalency to what's happening in front of our eyes in the real world. So I think a lot more people are actually a lot more open-minded this time as it would pertain to the current monkeypox situation. They're more aware that maybe something's different, maybe something's acting in a way that we didn't anticipate, and they're trying to sort of steel themselves and be more prepared for that possibility. So I think overall, science and medicine's taking this extremely seriously. And I think people, even despite their sort of loss in trust and confidence in those institutions over the course of COVID, which I think in many respects is well placed, I think we can place a little bit more trust from the get-go for monkeypox here, simply because it's a known entity. We've appeared to get out ahead of it to some degree. We're actively looking for it. We're trying to quarantine people. This isn't like the start of COVID where we just kind of like sat on our asses and like waited for incremental steps to happen. Like things are actually moving pretty quick as far as public health is concerned. So I'm not super worried about it. I'll just add a lot of the general public health precautions apply. Wash your hands, take a shower, don't have like sex with people who have very evident lesions on their body. I would actually encourage people to like educate themselves as to what the lesions look like, just to feel more prepared. That's a simple Google image search away. It's going to be a little gross, so just a heads up. But again, if anybody who either belongs to LGBTQIA+ community or knows MSM populations, do not stigmatize monkeypox as a gay disease, because you will make any folks in those communities less likely to come forward if they think they might have something like monkeypox or something that like looks like monkeypox. If you stigmatize these people, they will be reluctant to actually seek medical care, and that will actually make the spread worse. They'll possibly transmit it to more people and extend the current situation beyond what it otherwise would have been. So I think that's kind of the general set of things I would add on to everything you said.
Marvelous. Thank you for that. All right. Well, 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐺, thank you very much for coming on to explain this to us. We really appreciate your time. So what I'm going to do is 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐺 has a Discord where he talks about science. I am reasonably well fluent in most elements of I've got a BA and so I've studied science, but 90% of what's on that Discord is like me, body, head, his stuff. But it's a great place to learn about this, to ask questions. We'll link to that and to his Twitch channel. Thank you very much for coming. Sorry, unfortunately, we did lose Zandring. Tomorrow night, we're going to have Commander Lance McMillan. We're just going to have a nice fireside chat. I don't think he drinks scotch, so I don't know how this is going to work. And even if he did, we're like 3,000 miles away. But I'm going to buy a scotch on him. We're going to sit. We're going to talk. He has been a huge resource for us during the Ukraine war, and we're obviously going to continue to rely on him, but we figured it would be nice to just have a nice relaxing evening. We're going to talk some von Clausewitz, military philosophy, history of Russia and Nazis. It'll be a blast. So that'll be tomorrow night. I think we have that 9 p.m. Eastern. So hope you all will join us. 𝗂𝐚𝐥𝐺, once again, thank you very much. It was both fun and informative as always. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure being here. And I guess as a postscript, if you find anything about that, like any links to share about that CDC leak or whatever, you can always DM them to me, because I'll do some digging on my own accord. But now you've got me curious. So.
I will get to that as soon as and if I forget, hit me up, and we'll also figure out about that show on science conspiracy theories. Actually, we could also bring on, now I've got an idea. I've got a fun idea for a show. Dr. Conspiracy, you, me, is Zandering. What's the deal with science sitting on the cure for cancer? All right. Thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a good night.